Live theater has a glamour like no other place, a community of actors like no other people, whose moments on stage can become immortal. Maybe more immortal than you think. The spirit of Broadway's greatest performers lives on. Sometimes they never really die.
There are a lot of places in New York that are haunted, and the theater district has really more than its share of ghosts. We have some of the theaters where sound comes through the wall and there's nothing on the other side of the wall. Sometimes parts of ghosts appear. One of the theaters where a woman's legs is all you see, dressed in old-fashioned stockings and shoes.
I don't believe in ghosts, but I know what I saw.
Deep beneath one of the oldest theaters is a secret passage unused for decades.
There is a tunnel in the subcellar of this building used by different dignitaries, senators, mayors, as a quick way to get out of the New Amsterdam Theater. There was a small ladder that they would climb up, and they would actually emerge behind a newspaper stand where there was a trap door.
And did you know there was a club during World War II where 3 million servicemen danced with Broadway's biggest stars?
These guys had a great, wonderful, marvelous New York night that they could treasure as they went off to God knows what.
He was one of America's greatest actors, but people remember him as the brother of the man who shot Abraham Lincoln. But Edwin Booth was no killer.
Edwin Booth knew nothing about his brother's intention. He would have done something to stop his brother from performing that act if he had known about it.
Magic, tradition, legend. The world of the theater holds many mysteries, and they're just some of the best-kept secrets of New York.
You could argue that Edwin Booth was the most famous actor of the 19th century. And he was hailed as the hope of living drama. Now, the style of acting that existed earlier in the 19th century would be, to our eyes in the 21st century, very artificial, very over the top, extremely declamatory and excessively theatrical.
You would be to be or not to be, that is the question, you know, and making these grand gestures and grand faces, which they needed to do because they wanted to reach the back of the audience, you see, in a huge, huge house. But Booth would sit there and say, to be or not to be, that is the question. He thought about what he was saying. He internalized what the mood of Hamlet would be.
It was sophisticated, it was subtle, it was emotional. It had a naturalism to it that was utterly different than the style that was used before.
The Booth family was really an acting dynasty, starting with Edwin's father, Junius, America's first great Hamlet, then continuing with Edwin and his younger brother, John Wilkes. But unlike Edwin Booth, John Wilkes had been raised in the South.
John Wilkes Booth became something of a matinee idol. He was a very handsome guy. He was in his early 20s, but because he was in the South, he got caught up in that whole Southern philosophy and saw the Southern point of view.
John Wilkes Booth was a supporter of the Confederacy, and when Edwin told his brother that he had voted for Lincoln's re-election, the younger Booth went into a rant and said that Lincoln was trying to set himself up as the king of America.
When the assassination took place, his family, his mother and brothers and sisters, were arrested and held for a few days until they were certain they weren't involved in the conspiracy at all.
Edwin Booth said that April 15th, 1865, which was the date that his younger brother assassinated the president, was the most terrible day of his life. And he was so aggrieved about it and so stricken that he actually retired from the stage.
Booth didn't stay retired for long. After a few months, the public demanded his return. And in January 1866, at the old Winter Garden Theater in New York City, Booth reappeared in his signature role as Hamlet.
In the second scene of the play where Hamlet appears, the curtain went up and there was Booth sitting in his chair at court The audience broke into an ovation that lasted for quite a few minutes. And he wept. He was so moved that they accepted him again.
I can only imagine what it was like to be at the Winter Garden Theater the night that Edwin Booth returned. His family's story was so connected with this huge tragedy, the assassination of the president, and his life had been so damaged by it. And yet this role was so iconic for him. And of course, the story of Hamlet, the Shakespearean tragedy, it must have been incredibly moving to sit there and watch him take that stage again.
There are two secrets of New York connected with Lincoln's murder. 6 months before the assassination, Edwin, John Wilkes, and another Booth brother all appeared together at the Winter Garden Theater in a production of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. In the play, it was Edwin who played one of Caesar's killers. The other secret is that more than a year before Lincoln's murder, Edwin Booth was at a crowded train station in Jersey City when he spotted a well-dressed young man who had slipped onto the railroad tracks.
He fell under the train, and the train started to take off. Booth jumped off the stairs, grabbed him by his coat, and pulled him out in time and just barely saved his life. And he found out later that the young man whose life he saved was Robert Lincoln, the son of Abraham Lincoln. And a year and a half later, Booth's brother killed the young man's father. It's one of the great unknown stories in American history.
Booth rounded up supporters like Mark Twain and General William Tecumseh Sherman to help establish a social club for actors and other professionals. They named it the Players Club, and it became the city's oldest club to remain at its original location, right on Gramercy Park.
It's a who's who of the American theater. We've had members as varied as the conductor Toscanini, Mayor LaGuardia, Ernest Hemingway, Norman Rockwell. On the top floor, we have Booth's bedroom. And in memory of Booth, it's remained pretty much the same since the day he died in June of 1893.
Going into Booth's bedroom is like going back in time. Since the day Lincoln was shot, Edwin never spoke his brother's name again. Yet he kept by his bedside a portrait of John Wilkes. And there's a deeper mystery here. The real secret in this room is this human skull. It belonged to a thief whose last request, before they hanged him, was that his skull be given to Booth's father. So when Junius Booth and then his son Edwin played Hamlet, this is a skull they used. That's one way of achieving immortality on the stage. Another is to make a classic film filled with just about every star on Broadway. It was called Stage Door Canteen, and America had just entered World War II.
I wonder how many boys will be in tonight.
Oh, the usual number, I guess. 6,000 were here over the weekend.
Still keeps up, isn't it wonderful?
Wonderful.
The idea was that it would be a free nightclub open to men in uniform in New York City, in Times Square, where the entertainment community would literally serve the soldiers. On a given night at the Stage Door Canteen, it was pretty extraordinary who you might see. Vincent Price was there as a busboy, Ingrid Bergman serving food, Lauren Bacall. I think we have to understand that in that era, there was such a feeling of support and commitment.
Yes, that's right. We're in a war and we've got to win. And we're going to win. And that's why the boy you love is going overseas. And isn't that maybe why you're going to go back in there and get on your job?
A guy who may have grown up in Iowa, got shipped off to somewhere for basic training, came through New York on his way to shipping out to Europe, could go and could actually see a star. And the stars could express their appreciation for what these guys were going to do.
I hope you don't sail California. I hope you'll be back because I'd like to be your girl again.
If you put yourself in the shoes of some of these young men who are about to go face the greatest calamity the world had ever known,
she's a bombshell from Brooklyn. And
if you could go in and be treated to this, really what amounted to a splendid send-off, It was an expression of American unity and pulling behind the war effort with the glitz and glamour of the Broadway stage.
New York City's Stage Door Canteen was a model for 7 more service clubs around the country. But New York's Canteen was the original. The biggest stars of the 1940s came out to support the troops. Comedians like Georgie Jessel, who invented the telephone skit.
You're engaged now 33 years, Anna.
Dancers like Ray Bolger, famous as the Scarecrow in The Wizard of Oz.
Hey, Sergeant!
Jazz greats like Count Basie and Ethel Waters.
When you sang me a love song, you used to make me sigh.
It was all an idea from the organization that became the American Theater Wing, which hosts the Tony Awards each year.
There were a lot of things that were given to the soldiers as they passed through the Stage Door Canteen, like this deck of playing cards. And there were probably a lot of guys on a lot of nights during World War II who sat playing cards that they picked up at the Stage Door Canteen.
There's a secret you might walk right past on West 44th Street. It's a bronze plaque where the Stage Door Canteen once stood. It also represents a theater tradition that's just as strong now as it was in 1943.
Within the theater community, the spirit of charity, of generosity, of commitment is absolutely unabated. The Actors Fund and Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS, which are organizations that have real meaning in the life of people today.
The theater district has grown a lot since the 1940s. Almost 1 million people pass through Times Square every day. Yet, dense as the place is, it has its share of hidden spaces. Built into the fabric of the old theaters are the private studios of producers and directors who created 20th century theater. They're the Broadway secrets almost no one is allowed to see.
Theater actually is a world unto itself, and so much of it is the show that you put on, but behind that show are all of those people working to create the illusion that is the magic of theater. So in a way, the presence of the apartments, the offices, it's the thing that you're not supposed to see behind the curtain, but it's the thing that actually adds up to the magic.
The Lyceum on West 45th Street is one of the oldest theaters on Broadway, built at the turn of the 20th century by producer Daniel Froman. At the very top of the building is Froman's apartment, where he controlled the fate of almost every show in New York. He created a theatrical monopoly called the Syndicate.
Daniel Froman was really a key player in the story of theater as big business. He and his brother and some other partners created a business touring theatrical productions and also buying up theaters around the country. They bought and controlled theaters along the major railroad lines.
Today, the Froman Apartment is the Shubert Archive, an extensive collection of theater history founded by the Shubert Organization, Broadway's largest theater owner.
From 1900 to the present, we're kind of a unique collection of the running of theaters and the producing of theater.
Here, among the portraits of Broadway stars and century-old playbills, is a true secret of New York. Hidden in one of the walls is a tiny door that looks right down on the stage 3 floors below.
Daniel Froman was married to a woman named Margaret Illington, who was part of his theater company. The story is, if Miss Illington was overacting, he had told her to watch the trap door and he would wave a white handkerchief for her, and supposedly that's how they communicated from the apartment. If you know it's there, it can be fairly easy to spot it from the stage.
Of all the Broadway secret apartments, the one hidden above the Belasco Theater on West 44th is the grandest of them all. It's a larger-than-life residence for someone who dominated Broadway in 1900, David Belasco.
David Belasco was a giant at that time. In those days, if you were an actor, once you became involved with a particular producer, you pretty much stayed with that producer for the rest of your career. And Belasco was one of these guys. He was a power unto himself.
His 11-room apartment was fitted out like a Gothic church. Belasco's habit of dressing up like a priest with a clerical collar earned him the nickname the Bishop of Broadway. Today, except for some stained glass and Tiffany skylights, the apartment above the Belasco Theater is empty of everything in its past, except, perhaps, for David Belasco himself.
Well, the Belasco Apartment is known as one of the most haunted places on Broadway. David Belasco is one of those ghosts that appear fully articulated, that look like a person in full color, with clothes and feet and shoes. And if you were in the same room with them, you would think that you were sitting in a room with a living person.
Robert Viagas is an editor for Playbill magazine and the Playbill Yearbook, the record of every show that plays on Broadway during a given year.
As editor of the Playbill Yearbook, I have somebody on the show called the correspondent, somebody who actually works on the show and tells me stories about backstage life. And I always ask them about ghosts. I have never seen a ghost. I don't know if I believe in ghosts. I'm just reporting what people have told me.
Broadway ghost stories often come from people who work in a particular theater day after day, like one of the managers of the Belasco Theater, whose office was right underneath the old Belasco Apartment.
She works there often late at night, and she said that at one point they had installed motion sensors because she kept hearing sounds coming from the apartment above, and they were worried that teenagers had climbed over the roof from one of the buildings nearby and had gotten in. And she would sit there with the motion sensor going, and she could hear the sounds of a party upstairs. She could hear people dancing, she could hear footsteps, she could hear old-fashioned music, and the motion sensor was not registering anything. And she said, "Oh, I'll tell you a funny story, you're gonna think I'm crazy, but I have to tell you, I sit here and I hear people walking around up there all the time." And she said, "I go up and check, there's never anybody there."
Performers who play the Belasco Theater sometimes catch a glimpse of the old man himself. It happened to one of the actors in the musical Passing Strange back in 2007 as he sat in front of his dressing room mirror.
He was getting made up, and he was looking in the mirror, and he saw Belasco sitting on a chair. It looked like he was sitting right behind him. It was an all African-American production, and here was this old white man sitting, and he said, "I knew this man was not part of our cast." So I turned around to tell him, "What are you doing here?" The chair was empty, and when you look back at the mirror was empty as well.
The Belasco isn't New York City's only haunted theater. Another is the New Amsterdam, one of Broadway's oldest, and the site of one of its legendary revues, the Ziegfeld Follies.
Florence Ziegfeld was a young impresario. He actually started in the Chicago World's Fair as a person promoting strongmen, but he had an idea and a concept of the Follies, which is a wonderful presentation of the most beautiful girls in the world on the stage with singing, music, and comedy. And he launched that Follies right here in the New Amsterdam Theater.
There was another naughtier Ziegfeld show on the rooftop of this theater.
Yes, there was. The Midnight Frolic, Ziegfeld's famous Midnight Frolic. And this was conceived actually as an experimental theater where Ziegfeld could test some of his acts before they came to the main stage. There was a balloon girl that would come out bathed entirely in balloons, scantily clad with balloons on her, and the gentlemen would take their cigars and pop the balloons. Another aspect of the rooftop theater was the famous glass runway. They actually installed a glass runway. When the girls would come up, the gentlemen seated below the runway could look up under their skirts.
Today, the New Amsterdam's runway has been replaced with frosted glass and the old rooftop theater enclosed with office space. But this is where Olive Thomas got her start, Ziegfeld's most famous chorus girl. And if we're to believe the stories, it's possible Olive is still here.
Olive Thomas was one of Ziegfeld's favorites for a variety of reasons. First of all, she was a very talented performer. She was also quite beautiful. She had stunning violet blue eyes. She also took up with Ziegfeld to a certain degree.
The Midnight Frolics gave Olive Thomas the path to instant success with all its glamour and tragedy. She went to Hollywood to make movies and married Jack Pickford, brother of Mary Pickford, one of the great film stars of the silent era. But the marriage quickly soured, and in 1920, the couple went to Paris on a kind of second honeymoon. It was not to be.
After a very late night of partying, they came back to their apartment around 3 o'clock in the morning. Jack fell right asleep. Olive couldn't sleep, so she went to the medicine cabinet trying to find a sleeping potion, which was the 1920s version of a sleeping pill. She ingested the potion. when she realized it was actually mercury bichloride, labeled in French. She didn't read French, and she had poisoned herself. She screamed, "What have I done?" Jack ran into the bathroom, found Olive collapsed on the floor. They rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late.
After the grieving for the young star was over, it wasn't long before strange things began to happen at the theater that had made Olive famous.
Since the 1920s, we've had reports of Olive Thomas appearing in this building. It usually happens when a major event is occurring, like a load of a show or a restoration of this building. Back in 1997, we hadn't opened the building yet, and we didn't have all the lights activated in the building. So the security guard, he had his flashlight and he was shining it over the audience where the seats were, and felt a presence behind him. So he glanced over his right shoulder, and he saw a woman in a beaded gown walk from one side of the stage to the other with a bottle in her hand. She stopped, turned, blew him a kiss, and then walked out through the wall onto 41st Street.
Through the wall?
That's what he reported. I get the phone call around 3 o'clock in the morning to come over to the theater to meet a very nervous security guard who would not go back inside. We searched the entire building. There was no one to be found.
How was Olive dressed?
He described her in a beaded gown with a green sash with a beaded headdress. And it was very interesting because this was a security guard. He was not a theater historian, he was not an actor, but he described an outfit that Olive actually wore.
What happened when they showed the guard all of the photos of the chorus girls? Was he able to find Olive Thomas from the photos?
We had about 25 photographs of the girls. We brought him back and asked him to identify who he saw that night. Well, he walked into the room without even having to ask him. He pointed directly to Olive Thomas and said, "That's the girl I saw."
Is that really true?
Absolutely true.
And when did this take place?
This happened in 1997.
There have been many sightings in the theater since Olive died in 1920. Strangely, she seems to appear only to men.
She was very flirtatious with males. So we solved the problem by putting a woman security guard on the midnight shift.
Have you ever seen Olive Thomas?
You know, I've never seen her, but I've certainly felt her presence in a place like this. Such a beautiful theater with so much history. There have been occasions when you're walking through the theater alone at night where you might feel a subtle touch on your shoulder or a tap on your back, almost to say, "I'm approving of what you're doing. Keep going forward."
There's a picture of Olive Thomas at every entrance to the theater, and if you look at the one near the stage door, you'll see the marks of the performers who've touched it for good luck over the years. If there were a place I might meet Olive, it could be in the secret tunnel in the New Amsterdam's basement that runs under the street. It was an escape route for important men who didn't want to be seen leaving Ziegfeld's midnight frolics with a chorus girl. So they'd make their way through the tunnel and up a ladder, where they'd pop out near a newspaper stand. I didn't see Olive, but remember, she only appears to men, especially men who work in the theater, like stagehand Drew Siccardi.
I was up on the 6th floor working on something for the show, and I had my back turned to these stairs that went up to the old theater. And I had to turn around. I don't know why, but I turned around, and all I saw from the waist down going up the stairs to the other theater.
What was she wearing?
Just from the waist down, just wearing, it was sort of white, transparent legs. I mean, it was sort of ghostish, is what you can say.
Do you think it was real? After all, it was transparent.
It was transparent, but I know it was real because the stairs going up to the other theater is a brick wall going up, and this was white, and it was a person.
You were well aware of the fact that she liked to be at this theater?
Yes. There's been lots of stories of her, people running across her or things missing, or like one time, don't know if it was Olive or what, we were leaving and we had these prop pieces all in the stage, and we were walking down the stairs and all of a sudden they just started banging together, and we were like, "Ooh, okay, good night, Olive," and we just kept on going.
When you told the first person that you saw or felt Olive Thomas's presence, what did that person say to you?
Oh, you're crazy.
And? Are you?
No, well, not. We're all crazy in one way, but no, I know what I saw. And I don't believe in ghosts, but I know what I saw. So, yes, I do believe in them.
The New Amsterdam is one of the most beautifully restored theaters on Broadway. The hit show Mary Poppins has been playing here for 5 years. But each night, when the actors leave and quiet returns, every Broadway theater is left with a single point of light on stage. That's just the way it's always been.
It is referred to by everybody as the ghost light, and part of it is to keep you from coming in from backstage and stepping off into the audience. But also there is a belief that spirits can fill a void. So the shedding of light makes it a safer place.
You always start every show by turning off all the lights. All the lights go down, and for a moment you're completely in the dark. And then it's like a dream begins.
Is it a dream? Is it real? In the theater, it's both. And in that special world of make-believe, who knows who you might meet just before the lights go down. There are secrets all around this beautiful and glittering city. You just have to know where to look for them. When America went to war, New York City was the gateway to battle.